Hi, this is Colin from class. I'm doing a report on the Sami peoples of northern Scandinavia. Evidence of human settlement has been found since about 8000 BC. That's 10,000 years ago. They've been here forever. And the Romans in 117 AD described them as being hunters who used skis to catch their prey, wearing reindeer furs, having bow and arrows, and basically being too poor for them to consider taxing, which they considered a rarity. Quite importantly, they were not a single peoples, ethnically speaking, and groups of about 5 families or so would be the norm. We had forest Sami, sea Sami, mountain Sami, taiga Sami, for example, and elements of these populations, as classified, were also potentially of the same ethnic group, having switched over to a different lifestyle. So this complicates analysis further, so we're not talking about any homogeneous group at all. In fact, their religion reflected upon this. It was very complex and dependent upon the group involved, and also implicated souls returning to the earth as fish or bears or elk or other kinds of animals. There were deities for various aspects of nature. For example, the thunder, the sun, the moon, the mountains, and all that. Family gods that would protect and intervene on behalf of each family if properly worshipped, and idols known as Sieidis. They were usually stones that were offered sacrifice, rather large stones, ones that kind of stood out in the land mass involved usually, and you would usually offer sacrifice to them in the form of animal fat or entrails from what you caught. You would basically make a prayer to it, and telling it that you would offer a part of your catch if you caught something, and hopefully it would help you. There were stories of hunters who made an offering of one elk to the Sieidi, and then coming across 2 elk that had their horns entangled, and then saying, I'm not going to do it anyways, loosing your arrow, basically about to shoot, and then they come undone and escape. That's the kind of stories they told themselves. Also, fishermen who cursed at the Sieidi would lose their catch, and the sky would turn ugly. So that's also the kind of narratives that were present. You would find antlers, coins, arrowheads at those sites in particular, because those were the parts that could survive the elements over time. So evidence of a Sieidi could easily be found by digging. Modern-day continuation of such a practice includes tossing coins at these stones while you're driving on the highway for good luck. Nobody really remembers why, but that's understood now to be the root of these traditions. The religion that they had was one of shamanism. There were sacred drums involved that were carved or dyed with certain patterns, and poetic chants known as yoiking. I don't really know how to do it and wouldn't try because it would be rather disrespectful, I think. There is a lady on YouTube who practices it. You might want to look her up. So that's worth mentioning. The traditional Sami lifestyle is perceived as being one of nomadic reindeer herding. However, that tradition began less recently than before, because due to pressures from the kingdoms to the south. In fact, this parallels what happens with the Plains indigenous people, who often were originally from the east until they were driven into nomadism by such settlements. In fact, many of the forest Sami, for example, were originally reindeer hunters who kept relatively small numbers as pack animals to help lifting loads, and decoys for hunting in order to capture more pack animals, or to just hide behind as they shot some that were out in the wild. Now, at that point, there were population pressures, mostly from the kingdoms to the south, and the depletion of wild game, especially when firearms start to be introduced. However, during the times of the bubonic plague, the Samis did a bit better than most Europeans due to the fact that they were not as close in contact with the viruses. However, it did very much spread between communities. Nevertheless, they did not suffer as awfully due to better hygiene, mostly, I'd say, and basically got to escape the very worst of it, which may have led to their surviving past that time a little bit longer and allowing them to still be here, which is usually the other way around for most the way this usually goes. However, during the times of the European monarchs, the Sami were also very much hurt by taxation. As early as 900 AD, we have records of taxation. Every year, they had to bring a whole bunch of dried fish, furs, goose down, different ship cables made out of seal or whale skin. A lot of that was going on, so life wasn't very easy here, especially given the fact that the traders themselves were eventually made into the tax collection agents, and the Samis were fined if they paid taxes to another kingdom. So that made life especially bad when you had to consider that we had Finland, Denmark, and Sweden doing the same thing. So cases of triple taxation and fines were pretty much a fact of life, which will definitely cut into their lives and their ability to live. There was a lot of nomadism that was triggered by this kind of behavior, just trying to avoid those tax agents and those missionaries. In fact, there was also a lot of religious persecution where shamans would be imprisoned and then burnt alive for quote-unquote recidivism. The farming industry also didn't help, because although the taiga where the deer lived and the farmland where the farming was done were theoretically separate, the swamps were a common contention point, where the farmers would want hay from the swamps to feed their animals, and the Sami would need lichen for the deer from the swamp for them to eat. So that was, or also whatever deers eat in the swamp. I'm not really certain about how elk survive, but they needed the swamp, and you can imagine how those conflicts usually turned out. Silver was eventually found in Swedish territory, and the Sami were forced either to work as mine slaves or as carting slaves, basically, to bring the ore to be processed. This killed a number of their reindeer herd and the handlers themselves, the Samis, when, say, sleds would tip. So this was dangerous work that was very poorly compensated, if at all. So we are talking about enslavement, which further drove to more migration to avoid these jerks who try to do that to you. So this eventually stopped because the silver deposits were found to be insignificant, but then iron mines were found and the ore was of extremely good quality. So railroads were brought in, which caused even more disruptions, and especially to the reindeer herds. So this made life even more difficult, led to further marginalization, further push to the north that we've witnessed here, and to a place on the taiga, which led to large-scale reindeer herding, because you could supervise large herds up there more easily than you could in the forest or on the coastline, on the fjords, for example. So now everyone thinks Sami were reindeer herders. Well, they were kind of forced into it eventually. The church-run schools started being set up, and language bans became a more recent innovation. We're still unclear about the level of abuse in those religious schools, because it took place far before the current scandal in Canada that we're still dealing with. So there were at that point no survivors, but it's reasonable to expect that there was similar treatment, unfortunately. Another thing to mention was that the Nazi occupation was quite horrible, and the retreat itself was a scorched earth policy, which made life, even if you can imagine it, nastier. More recently, in 1981, there was the Alta Dam project, which led to a large shows of civil disobedience, and although that dam eventually went up, it led to the establishment of various Sami parliaments in Norway, Sweden, and Finland. They have different levels of authority and different levels of power. For example, the Swedish one is basically tasked with enforcement of what the Swedish parliament says they should do, whereas Finland and Denmark may have a little bit more leeway. I know that in Denmark, for example, the fallout of the Alta Dam project led to the Sami being recognized as an indigenous peoples as opposed to an ethnic minority, which came with an increase in cultural status and understanding of legitimacy. At this point, land titles, however, are not recognized in the respective Supreme Courts as recently as in the 1980s, actually. So that is very much an ongoing issue. We also have, however, on the plus side, very much a resurgence of interest in the culture, in the roots, in reindeer herding. Even though we have most modern Sami live lives in cities, we have certain people wanting to quote-unquote go back to this. So that is something that's interesting. So even if many of the practices have been destroyed and displaced, we have a strong element that is surviving. Very much like in modern day North America and South America. However, there has been a history of persecution and adaptation, but the Sami people have proven to be very resilient and still very able to maintain their cultural identity, which I guess is a good thing. Well, which is obviously a good thing, even if all of those bad things have happened. But I don't just want to sugarcoat it, because things haven't been easy at all, and their history has been one of trying to avoid conflict with people we can say have been acting as jerks for a while. Although in the early history, there were definitely a period where the Vikings would intermarry and cooperate heavily. Up to modern day, this seems to have more or less turned antagonistic. Now, I believe that there will be more and more interest in this as reading in these matters continues, and I hope that people get more engaged in this. Thank you very much again for watching this video, and have a lovely weekend. Bye.